Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the virtual MedTech conference. The title of the conference today is Connecting the Care Continuum, Data as the Red Thread for Healthcare Providers and Industry. By way of introduction, my name is Peter Schulam. I am from Johnson & Johnson. I've been there for 1 year prior to joining J&J as the global head of preclinical, clinical, and medical in med device. I was the former chair of the Department of Urology at Yale School of Medicine and Chief Innovation and Transformation Officer at the Yale New Haven Health System. We have two panelists joining us today. I'll introduce each of them briefly and then ask them to expound a bit on their background. First is Dr. Naomi Udanen, Chief Data Scientist with Nanoware. Naomi, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, I'm glad to be here. So right now at Nanoware, we are focusing on developing algorithms for continuous data capture and analysis, basically to enable real-time remote patient care. So I'm really thrilled to be here.
Great, thanks, Naomi. And our other panelist is Leslie Wise. Leslie is the president and CEO of Evidence Matters, global marketing access strategy company. Leslie?
Hi, Peter. How are you? Thanks for inviting me to participate. I think this is going to be a great panel. I have a long history working in the device industry in market access and commercialization, as well as clinical research in the medical device space. And so I'm definitely excited. I do a lot of stuff. I support MedTech Innovator, which is the largest accelerator. And they partner with AbdiMed also, as well as the Texas Medical Center Innovation Center. So I also am doing a lot of things with digital health companies. So this is a pretty exciting time to be in MedTech.
Great. Well, thank you, Leslie. Thanks, Naomi. So I think just to set the stage, we all realize that COVID has accelerated the adoption and development of digital solutions. The question now is, what are the lessons learned and how can we further catalyze this disruptive transformation? And, as a surgeon myself, I tell everyone, we would be in the hospital every day working and using Epic and other things, but I was always struck by when I would go home, I felt as though we had much more digitally enabled solutions within our home and within our cars and other aspects of our life. And one of the last bastions of disruption, I feel, is actually in healthcare. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, and we'll see if we can get into this a bit more. I think the best way to start, and we've discussed this before, is really to frame what is digital. So number one, what do we mean by big data? What is AI and machine learning? Because I think we all use these phrases, but really don't understand what they really mean. I will start by just saying, from my perspective, we look at what we're doing at Johnson & Johnson medical devices. In the past, I would say that we were building things with plastic and metal, and we're creating tools that had a certain function. Now what's unique is that we're all beginning to lay on top of these mechanical solutions a digital aspect, and that is perhaps a sensor. And so for me, what I think of digital is we have devices that can generate data, aggregate data, and then process that data. And in the processing mode, we're actually gaining insights, or there's predictive analytics associated with it. So that's my simple understanding of digital. But I'll turn first to Naomi, and we can go anywhere you want, Naomi. We can start with digital and then go to data, and then really what you do with that data. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that you hit on a really important point. So there is a differentiator between AI and ML. They're not quite interchangeable terms. The way I like to think of AI, which stands for artificial intelligence, really is an overarching field of which ML, machine learning, is a subset. So the goal of AI really is to simulate human intelligence to solve complex problems. This is super vague and broad, right? So ML, which is an application of this field and tries to drive us towards achieving this goal, really aims to learn from data and wants to be able to predict results for new data that's coming in. So ML is basically the application of AI, or one such application.
Do you want to comment on the concept of big data? What is meant by that? And that data unto itself is really, there's not much value?
Right. So this is a point that I like to discuss often with my colleagues. And I think this is probably of great interest to this conversation as well. So there's been a trend recently that has emphasized the accumulation of data as the end goal in and of itself, where realistically, all of that data is relatively meaningless unless it's interpreted. So to me, big data isn't necessarily just a collection or even a massive collection of data. It's the utility of that data and how that data really gets used to drive insights we wouldn't have had the opportunity to derive before.
Great, thank you. Leslie, I'll give you the same question so we can talk about data, big data, AI, ML, or the word digital.
Yeah, I think that, the way I look at it, and this is how I try to communicate it to people, if the data can't become information, then it's useless to us, right? So we have to be able to transform data to information. And that speaks to, this concept of garbage in, garbage out, right? So the data has to be, or should be, more structured. I think as we go forward, we're getting better at how we collect that data and making sure that we have a certain rigor, right? Because I think in the past, we weren't always collecting every piece. We weren't designing registries well. We were just sort of like, anything comes in, it's fine. I think we're learning now that trying to structure that data as it comes in is important. And then, of course, the diversity in the data sets. That's the other thing that's, I think, is going to we're going to see some variations happening now, because if we're not collecting data across disease states, across all the different populations, we'll continue to have solutions, or what we think are the solution to treating a disease, where that just may be a solution for a subset of patients. And if we have greater diversity in our data sets, I think it'll be really important for machine learning and the predictive analytics. So I think that that's something that I'm really, passionate about, is making sure that we're really getting diverse data sets and that we're structuring that data in a way that it can become actionable information.
Yeah, and I think we should underscore that because, when you look at big data, if you actually can have a data set that is interrogatable, machine learning will then look at that data set, detect patterns, and then create an algorithm such that then when you give it another input, it will give you the output that was built out by its ability to see that pattern. And that algorithm is what allows us to do that. So I think this is very important, because as we start to develop or utilize machine learning for healthcare, we have to be sure that we have representation of the community that's seeking that output. Because if we do it in only one segment of the population, and then you were to then take an individual from a different segment of that population, the actual output may not be correct. I don't know, Naomi, if you want to, I think this is a key concept as we start to think about how we build these data sets, how we build machine learning, and how we use these predictive analytics to help us in medical decision-making.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental point and a super important consideration in developing any sort of ML, particularly the understanding that anything that you train on really has to be representative of the population that you are hoping to use your generated algorithm on. I think that you highlight another really important point, which is, the algorithm in and of itself isn't smart. So you really have to understand, what is the application to which you're hoping to apply machine learning? Is it an appropriate application, right? So if you yourself wouldn't be able to explain, your expected outcomes of this application, then for sure a machine will not be able to. So we see a lot of this, in inappropriate applications of machine learning, like in the hiring process, where fundamentally the process in and of itself is pretty subjective, and that subjectivity leads to a lot of, I would say, uncomfortable, incorrect, or at best uninterpretable outcomes. Honestly, if nobody can understand how you got to where you got, I think it's relatively useless.
Right. And the other thing I think that is important, and the impact that it has, because, obviously I work on the reimbursement side of the business, right? And so today, Medicare doesn't reimburse digital health because it's not part of the benefit categories that were established in 1965, right? And of course, we want that to change. We need for that to change because it's too important. But I think that to make the argument and to justify that it's reasonable and necessary that CMS and other payers would pay for digital health, is we have to have really good data sets that lead to good information. If we don't establish or prove the clinical utility, then they'll continue to retreat behind, well, it's not part of the benefit category. But if we can really demonstrate with evidence, particularly improved outcomes and lower costs, right, then payers will absolutely support the adoption of being able to access this kind of information, because obviously what's in it for them is improved outcomes and lower costs, which is what we want across our system. So having really good data sets that can be turned into information that really improves outcomes, I think is just the key to turning the curve.
Leslie, so that's a very good point. What I'd like to do is go a little bit more high level on this, because it kind of sets the stage for why we're talking about this. Simplistically, the way I think about it, medical outcome is, first off, we have humans, so highly variable,
right,
administering medical care. And if we look at it, medical outcome, the outcome of either a procedure or a consultation is dependent upon, in my mind, and make it very simplistic, two things. It's either judgment and or skill. And it's really a product between the two, because you can have great judgment and very poor skill, and the outcome is not very good, and vice versa. So all of us on this call in the medical device field, I feel as though our call is to develop tools and technologies that augment judgment and enhance skill. And if we can do that, we can, in a way, push or democratize healthcare. And I tell people, when I speak to companies or surgeons, and we say, if you look at a pilot, we have no concern whether that plane is going to land or take off when we get onto the commercial flight. And the cockpit is surrounded with intelligence that's augmenting and supporting the pilots who are manning that plane. And we need to be doing the same thing in healthcare, and with the ability. And so I feel like we're at it's an inflection point within healthcare, because a company would create a stapler for me, great. But now if you can give me a stapler that gives input back to me so that I know what the outcome will be when I fire that stapler.
Right.
Because as I tell everyone, humans, unfortunately, follow a Gaussian distribution, a standard deviation of 1. We all remember that from our calculus days or in college. And so surgical outcome is very much similar to that. And if you think about it, 67% of people are around the average, but every surgeon thinks, or every physician thinks they're in the top 10%. And I think every patient thinks their physician is in the top 10%. What we need to do is kind of build that surgical or medical cockpit around healthcare, such that we narrow that variability and we shift the curve to the right. So that's how I conceptualize this. And this should be the mission for all of us moving forward, because we now have the ability to do it. We can create tools. You will always need a physician or a healthcare provider, but can we create an environment in which we can augment their judgment and enhance their skill? So I think that to me is where that should be our.
I think that's spot on. I mean, like, really, Peter, that's spot on. But that's obviously the big challenge, right? It is, there are a number of pieces within our healthcare system, because we have a very unique healthcare system, probably the most unique in the world, right? That has to change. There are a number of things that have to change, right? You've got to have technologies changing, you have to have institutions changing, and you have to have physicians being willing to accept those augmented tools. Because, if they're my age, they weren't trained that way, right? They were trained differently. But I do think that I see in younger physicians are much more apt and willing to accept and work with, because they've grown up in a world where their technology is at their fingertips. But I think the most important thing that you're saying, to summarize, it gets us to this thing that we've been talking about in healthcare at least for 30 years, which is personalized medicine. If you can really augment a physician's ability to understand in real time what the patient that walks through the door, right? Because he's going to have tools right there that he can look up and understand if it's a person of color that's, 58 years old and they're obese and blah, 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 blah. As they're making their judgment call, they're going to have a whole new set of data points to think about how they manage that patient versus how you manage a 35-year-old that's not obese, but that has some other, but they have the same condition, right? Maybe they both have cancer, or they both have, but you may need to manage them differently. And I think that's what this information, the clinical utility of this information, is going to allow us to really give more personalized care that will lead to the improvements. Because right now, standardizing procedures and techniques, I think that's key. But it's not a one size fits all medicine, right? Doctors are practicing medicine. They're not, every patient comes to them differently, right? I'm a patient, I would come to you one way. She's a patient, she would come another way. We might have the same disease, but you can't do the exact same thing. But if we give you better evidence and better knowledge, information in real time, then you can customize the treatment. And I think that's when we're going to really see a difference.
Yeah, to me, in my mind, we want to make medicine become more of a science, less of an art, because there are people that are very good at this, but we wanted to democratize this. So this brings in a good point. So in the last couple of years or so, there's been this accelerated adoption of telemedicine, which is just one piece of the digital transformation that we want to see within medicine. And I think there's been a lot of lessons learned. I think, Leslie, it is interesting that, it's not only the patients that have to adopt this technology, but the physicians. And I can tell you, there was a bit of resistance at Yale when we were talking about using telemedicine. COVID hit, and within 1 week, we went from, maybe 1% of our visits being via telemedicine to literally 100. Well, I wouldn't say 100 because we still did see some cancer patients, but close to 98%. And the adoption was forced by the situation. But there was a lot of lessons learned. And I think maybe we can just take a few minutes and think about what we've learned. And I think you've touched on a little bit of this. We have to be sensitive in the development of these technologies. We have to be practical and think about things like reimbursement.
Yeah.
We have to think about credentialing. We have to think about licensing. And these are some of the, I think the government did a very good job, and they were somewhat agile in helping us through this. And in order to accommodate the ability to see patients virtually. But I'll start with Naomi. Do you have any comments on that? And just to hear your thought, and then Leslie will switch it over to you. But let's stay on that theme of the obstacles learned in the last year or so.
Yeah, I think that from what I've seen, there's also been a lot of excess burden placed on the physician. I think a lot of these solutions really didn't think much about the workflow of the physician themselves. And one of the big areas of resistance that you saw was that, people became overburdened with all of this information. If you just dump a bunch of information on a doctor, that's not really helping them make any sort of decision. So I think really the goal became very clear. And that goal really was to, curate that information and those insights in such a way that would actually help, as you were saying, Peter, augment the physician's tool set rather than just dump a bunch of information on them. And so in developing these tools, I think what's a really important consideration is, the end user themselves. So how does it fit into their workflow? How would it help guide their decision making? How can we shift the burden of information off of the physician themselves and onto the algorithm?
Yeah, I think that's one thing, but I think that the other part, I think that made it clear to me, and it was great that we got the COVID rule, right, which changed being a Medicare paying for visits, and then all the other commercial payers followed suit. But the challenge is that connected devices. There's no, in some ways, it's still a Zoom call, right? You're talking to your doctor, you're updating them what's going on, but they can't get any biometric data unless you already were set up pre-COVID on something like that. But because there's no reimbursement for connected devices that would collect this. So let's say I had, I have an autoimmune disease. I have sarcoidosis, so I see a pulmonologist on a regular basis. They could ask me how I feel, but he can't hear my lungs. They don't know. And I think that the experience of COVID was great for digital health because it has highlighted the importance of connected devices. Now, I definitely agree with Naomi in that we have to be very careful about what information we're conveying, because we don't want information overload to the doctor. And so we have to make sure that they're getting the meaningful information, but the technology has moved to the place where many devices can wirelessly transmit data right into the EMR. There's a device that I work with that literally the doctor can hear lung sounds. So the technology is there. So technologically, we've moved to where we could literally do many things without having to go in. And I think we should stay there, but we haven't changed our reimbursement to support that. So we've got to, as a sort of from a policy standpoint, we've got to start to move forward and catch up to technology, because technology is out there, it's there. And I think it would transform medicine even more. But she's right. We can't have information overload. The doctors don't need 12,000 data points, right? They just need to know. And I think that's where our innovators must work with the clinicians. That's where you can't skip the doctor, right? I mean, and I hear people try to, well, no, this is still medicine. And the doctor is the doctor and the patient are at the center of this. So understand what the physician needs. And if you can deliver that, then you're going to win. But just doing something because it's technology, that's a mistake. It has to have clinical utility in decision-making for physicians and patients.
So, great comments. And what I want to do is summarize a bit. So I think Naomi started out with burden, and Leslie, you kind of followed up on that. So I went to a conference that a CTO from a large academic health system mentioned once they had the uptake of their electronic medical record, they said most of their job is actually identifying technologies that decrease the number of clicks the physician has to use when interacting with that electronic medical record. So we think we created something that was beneficial, but in fact, as Naomi pointed out, it became a burden, interrupted the workflow, and now there was another whole industry trying to decrease the number of clicks, and that has stuck with me. But I will tell you that everyone on this call, we have industry, everyone's looking at innovation, and this is to kind of underscore Leslie's comment. You could have the best technology, the coolest technology out there, but if it doesn't fit within the physician's workflow, it will fail. It doesn't matter. And what we talk about when we talk about innovation is you have to identify the unmet need, right, and there should be a clinical pull, not a technological push. And that's the key to success of actually innovation and the products that really win on the marketplace. And I think, Leslie, you mentioned this. So you start, the center is what is the unmet need? That's defined by the healthcare providers that you're working with, understanding their world, what the workflow is. Once you have identified that unmet need, you're looking for that clinical pull, the technology that will be, laid on top of that to help answer or address that unmet need. But at the whole time, you're doing this iterative process of making sure you're not disrupting the workflow. And then at the end of the day, too, what has to be incorporated is what's the business model.
Yeah.
And we all have seen technologies that have met those first two criteria, and then they fail on the third. So, this is an iterative process. And I feel as though you think of things like, what's the clinical, what's the technological, what's the business model, and all of these things during each one of these iterations or spin cycles has to constantly be checked as a yes. Because if you're not doing that, and we've seen technologies that have gone all the way out to almost, I wouldn't say launch, but to prototypes, and then they just fail because one of these simple steps had been missed. So I think that summarizes what both of you had just addressed. Are there any other things that we've learned within the last year and a half with respect to innovation and technology adoption that we should push forward? Naomi, I'll go with you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's not an easy problem to solve. And I think that there's been a lot of movement on, from tech companies specifically trying to jump into the healthcare space, thinking that this is just a question of, providers aren't technically adept, right? We can push them forward easily. We'll just, write some software and help them out. And that's going to fix all the problems. But the truth is that it turns out healthcare isn't an easy problem to solve. The issue is not necessarily a lack of software, a lack of, desire to solve these issues. So I think, Peter, you're exactly right? We have to put the doctor and the patient at the center of our technology, right? And that's the way that we need to approach any sort of solution to these problems. And consider that it's not actually the lack of technology or the lack of desire to, move us forward in solving these issues. It's the fact that we aren't really starting with the person, right? We're starting with a technology, or we're starting with, an idea, but it's not really being developed with the user at the heart. So I think once the pandemic certainly has highlighted that and has exposed a lot of these issues to the public, probably. In ways that we really didn't anticipate, but are frankly very grateful for, because now it's driving better and more accelerated development of solutions to these problems.
Yeah,
and I would say more thoughtful approaches.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, maybe they're not the center, but it's right outside the center, is you have to really understand, you were talking about business model, you have to understand the business model of healthcare in the United States and how it's paid for. Because while the physicians absolutely are the users, the purchasers and the customer sometimes is the payer in the hospital, right? And so understanding how that flows and knowing that you have a number of stakeholders and you must support what the value is for each stakeholder. So I've seen technologies that physicians love and hospitals are willing to purchase for a time. But if reimbursement never comes, hospitals are like, I can't keep doing that. There are some SaaS products that are just hospital purchases, but if a hospital, what many innovators don't know, hospitals have very narrow margins. And Peter, I'm sure you know this. Hospitals operate on very narrow margins. So if they're going to make a major purchase for something that they're not going to be reimbursed for, you have to really demonstrate that it's going to give them some kind of cost savings. There has to be tremendous value there for them to just take out of that 3% profit and take 0.5% to purchase this major, SaaS program. So understanding the business model of the healthcare system or whoever your ultimate customer is, whether it's the payer, the hospital, or the physician, if you understand them and how you can drive value, you can come up with a better business model. Because I can definitely tell you, the business model to a payer is going to be different than the business model to a hospital, than to a physician. So depending upon what kind of technology you have and where the purchaser sits, that really will help you figure out to be more successful with the business model. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I will tell you, and the world is changing. 20, 30 years ago, I would say a lot of med device companies were selling to physicians, surgeons, and they were driving some of the purchasing. And it wasn't uncommon to go into a hospital and see, every company represented in the stock room.
That's right.
That's not happening anymore. So there's consolidation happening within healthcare. There's consortiums being formed, and everyone is undergoing, value analysis. Procurement is looking, and they're looking for the best value. So we as a, I'm now moving across the street, so to speak, from being a healthcare deliverer to, into this industry. And we have to understand who our customer is. And our customer really, yes, we're serving physicians, but we're really selling to health systems. And this is not just within the United States. So all these, when we're thinking about innovation, we have to attack all of that. And I think ultimately, Leslie, you're right. We have to provide value to everyone. We have to provide value to ourselves, to our patients, and to the health systems that we serve, because that's the only way we all can survive. And it's going to be extremely important. I'd like to ask you one question I think is, how do you think telemedicine during the COVID period changed the expectations of patients?
Oh, I'd like to jump on that one. And this is because from a personal, so I have a daughter who's 31, actually works in the device industry also, and she was pregnant during COVID. And she was only seen or touched by her gynecologist twice through the entire pregnancy. That was really tough for her. She'd been pregnant, this is her third child. So she'd had 2 other children, had a very different experience. Now from that has birthed her creating a company called Navigate Maternity, because she's like, we've got to figure this out in a remote world, right? But I think it highlights some of the gaps in our system. The way that we were, how can I put it? We weren't prepared. That's one thing, certainly, right? We weren't prepared for COVID to happen. And then once it happened, like you said, doctors kind of saw cancer patients, some, right? Not even all cancer patients. It taught us that there's a gap. And that's why I said it highlights the need for connected devices. Because if you're pregnant, you want more than just to talk to your doctor on a Zoom call, right? Or anybody that's sick, if you've got a serious disease, a chronic disease. So I think for me, it highlighted how we have to really make it a focus to get these devices, these technologies that are being developed that would enable physicians in a remote setting to still manage the patients properly. I think it highlighted that need.
Yeah, no, very much on. Naomi, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this I think that there's a really important point here as well, Leslie, as you were saying. I mean, there was a gap right in the type of access that we could provide, but also I think there was a bit of a shift in who actually sets the expectations for care. So all of a sudden you saw that patients are now demanding better experiences from their mobile applications or telehealth applications. And this really drives home the point that, it's not just about the technology itself, it's about, who's using it. And so once you've actually driven that, you've made the shift from the hospital to at-home care, you really then need to also think about how would you better provision that patient experience. How will you make it easier to use, and how will you have patients more likely to use your device or your application? Because adoption also occurs at home and also needs to happen remotely. So if it's in any way difficult, you're going to see very, very poor retention, very poor adoption.
And what's really important about what she said, and I want to add this because that is exactly, so with my daughter, she went out and bought all these consumer products, right? They got their fetal monitors that you can get on Amazon and this kind of monitor and all that. And her husband happens to be a physician. And he was really, it was upsetting for him that she was doing that because she's not trained to use those kind of devices, but they're available in the consumer market. And I think that it is really important for us to start the conversation on what can be used in clinical decision-making, right? Is if she checks and she doesn't hear the heart rate, should she call her doctor and say, I can't hear the heartbeat? Should a doctor rely on that? Like, you understand it's opened up patients getting more involved in their healthcare, but maybe in ways that aren't wise, is what I'm saying, because there's so many consumer products out there. And so I think that's the other piece that we have to figure out going forward. Do we rely on the Apple Watch, or do we say, no, this has to have a clinical approval for physicians to rely on it to make clinical decisions?
And one of the things I was thinking about when I asked that question was about consumerism, because now all of a sudden there's another expectation amongst patients, just as it's easy, to download your Netflix, or, you think about everything we do with our iPhones or smartphones now. And I think there's an expectation that we're a little late to the game in medicine. And, now people want to have those, a virtual visit. And, it's astounding. I remember one patient, he was amazed. He was able to be at work, go out to his truck, get on his smartphone, have his consultation for 20 minutes, and then go right back to work. No need to drive an hour, right, pay for parking. I mean, a 15-minute, that was the key. The value to this individual was that 15-minute physician interaction without the cost of time on either end. Yeah. But I think there's consumerism moving forward that we have to start to think about what can we do in healthcare to accelerate access, and where do we meet the patient, so to speak. I think that's going to be key. And I think, we're starting to see this. A lot of people are talking about digital front doors.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, at least for me, I think the big difference that I see, right, between medical technology and the rest of the tech world really is in that end user experience. So the easier you make it for somebody to open that front door, right, as you were saying, the more likely it is that that person will adhere to your treatment plan, will access their healthcare provider, and will be more involved in their own care, hopefully resulting in better outcomes ultimately.
So for the past few minutes, we've been really centered. It's been more patient-centric. Let's go to the healthcare provider. What are they learning from this digitization and from telemedicine, the last year and a half, 2 years of COVID, and where are the opportunities there?
It's interesting because I think that depends upon the age group of the provider. That's what I'm seeing. So I don't think that doctors that I know that are more older, that are towards the end of their practice, are loving these changes because it's not comfortable for them. I think that physicians that are younger are loving the concept of remote unless they have to do surgery, right? I think doctors and healthcare providers, this really works for them. Like you said, especially with COVID, they may not even have to go to the office themselves, right? They can be in their home office They can talk to their patients, follow up on their care plans. Everything goes right into the EMR. They've saved hours off of their day, and it's time efficient for them. And I think that they're embracing, but I do know some physicians that are a bit older, just more, change. I think that's what I would say. It depends upon how well they handle change. People that have handled change well, I think they don't want to go back to the old world. People that don't handle change are like, I want to get back to the way things were before. And that's what I'm seeing.
Naomi?
I mean, yeah, so for us, actually, physicians have been our biggest cheerleaders, really from the get-go. I think that we have gotten enormous value from our interactions with physicians. And I think probably one of the biggest ways or sources of excitement for physicians, right, is in what you were saying, basically the ability to serve either in a better capacity or in a bigger capacity, more patients, drive better outcomes. But I think one of the things that we've really heard from physicians, as we've been developing our product and just in this space in general, is this need to build trust, right? So we need to build trust with the technology that we're developing, both, from the patient side, but also from the physician. And I think that really brings us to this idea of interpretability, right, with technology. So you can't just assume that nobody cares how you're doing what you're doing. I think a really key point in developing this technology is in explaining its utility, right, and its value to everybody involved. So, where the physician is involved is in interpreting the results, right, or potentially the predictions, whatever it is that your technology is putting out. So this needs to be intuitive, and it needs to be, super, super interpretable, because without that, you really don't get the trust that's necessary for widespread adoption.
Yeah, and I think that the other part about sort of what physicians probably have learned, and I think like my chart, for me, it's wonderful. Like I love my chart. I use it all the time. And that's been a huge piece of the telemedicine, because not only can I, because normally they give you your test results, tell them to you, never hand you a printout. But now I can go back and look at every blood test I've taken for the past 18 months, right? And can see if I have variations, things. And then as a patient, I can be more involved around what I should be doing to drive the better outcomes as well. And I think the physicians like that. The other thing is I don't have to wait every 3 months till I see my pulmonologist again. If there's something going on, I could shoot a quick note to him and he can get back to me in a day. And it doesn't eat up all of our time when I do have an appointment with him. So I think these tools, because there are a variety of them, right? And then of course there's remote monitoring, right? Now I think the reimbursement rules, again, sort of work against remote monitoring, because it requires so many minutes for the doctor to be able to bill, and but some things you're not checking for a half an hour. It doesn't take you a half an hour to look at it. But to meet the half an hour requirement, then maybe you got to check it 12 times in a month. That might be a little onerous, right? When everything is stable. So I think that the reimbursement rules, again, should encourage it. But I think remote monitoring is something that physicians also like, because now they know what's happening with their patients, even when they're not seeing them, right? And that's really important, because they're not going to be acute because I haven't seen you in 6 months. If I can monitor, your A1C, let's say you're a diabetic, and I know you're going to get your blood results, and I can look right in and see everything, then I can impact you before the next time I see you 6 months later, if you have built-in alerts. And that's just one example. But I do think that it's more actionable information that allows physicians to manage patients tighter.
And then, so we've talked about the patient, we've talked about the healthcare provider. I think also we have to think about the health system. How is digital going to provide value to the system, and then to payers, right? We have to, if we want to have a win-win, it has to be across the board when we can, and I think, there's no doubt that when you have sensors and things like in the operating room, I can imagine whatever wherever we're generating data, we're aggregating that data. There's information that can be fed back to the physician, but there's information that can be fed back to the health system, and also back to industry, to these companies, which may help actually further innovation and decide, we create a product to do X, it may be using more often in a Y type of manner, and we just don't gain that insight because we're not able to follow it. So there's multiple kind of layers to this whole process of digitization, and I think we have to just kind of explore. I think of You look at Amazon and the ability to shop now. I mean, to go into a retail store, I mean, you don't need to, and it's so easy. They make it almost too easy. And now now it's a question, can they deliver in less than 24 hours? It's amazing the evolution. It's really disrupted the ability to shop, for instance. And how in healthcare, I think we have, and the potential is huge. That we can impact. There's so many opportunities out there, but I think the key is to stay focused, define, who you're serving, make sure there's the unmet need, make sure you have the business model, and make sure that whoever the stakeholder is around that solution, that we understand. I had a program at Yale working with Medtronic, and it was a clinical immersion program for their engineers. And I remember they were in the OR one day, and a nurse, he was opening up a pack, and they said, "Why are you opening up the pack that way? It was not designed that way. It was meant to be placed on a flat surface, and you pull back the peel pack." And they were doing it by holding it in one arm. It was awkward, and there's a potential that. And they said, "Look around the OR. Do you see a flat surface that I could put this on?" So it actually was an aha moment, and they actually brought people from the operating room, techs and circulators and nurses, back to the company to start looking at their packaging, because they didn't understand, they had one perception of how those packages were open. And in fact, it was completely different. So understanding the stakeholder is unbelievably key.
Yeah. And just to tag onto that, and I'm sure Avdamed would love it. When I was within Avdamed, we built a value platform. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's on the Avdamed website, and you can download it, and they have it for devices and for diagnostics. And it kind of, everything Peter just said, it's a document that lays out the concepts and how you should think about it. And they actually do a value summit where companies can come and learn how to apply the value framework. But I just want to put that in because I think it's really, really useful, particularly for startups that don't really understand the whole system. Because those mistakes, like what you're saying, it's Medtronic, and so they can fix it and it's not going to hurt them. But if you're just one product and this is your first product and they can't stock it or they can't access it easily, and somebody else may not even have a better product, but it's easier to use, then they're going to go with ease of use. Because if the nurses have to use it and you make it difficult for them, they're not going to want it. They're going to want what's going to go in their flow of care. So you make a great point, but the value framework is a good tool to help companies figure all that out.
So we're almost at 45 minutes. And what I'd like to do is start to think about bringing this to a point. We don't have to use the whole hour, but I think, we've covered several topics here. And, I just want to allow each of you to kind of maybe summarize your thoughts, take a step back in what we discussed over the last 45 minutes. And, what would be your key messages or takeaway to the audience with respect to, now we're talking back about data, and as just to reconnect you to the title, data as the red thread for healthcare providers and industry. So I will let you choose which one goes first by allowing you to I'm not going to pick. I'll just give you a minute.
Naomi, you go ahead.
Yep, I can take this one first. Yeah, so I think ultimately we all ended on the point that interoperability actually is really important, right? Getting that feedback back to the developer, to the maker of the technology is super important, and kind of closing that loop. And so what I would say, the most important thing to consider in next steps, right, for next steps in developing these products is really, first of all, careful consideration, whether or not AI and ML specifically is the appropriate solution, right, for the problem that you're trying to solve. If sufficiently diverse data exists to train that ML, right, we touched upon that point, and the importance of that. And finally, whether or not the technology that you end up developing using these algorithms is actually interpretable and clinically useful. How does this help ultimately your end user at the end of the day, whether that be the patient, the provider, the healthcare system, or the payer?
Great.
Yeah.
Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would kind of almost go back to where I started, which is, the data has to be information, right? And it has to have utility. And so I think it has the power to change healthcare as we know it, and to make hospitals a very small part of the overall delivery of care. I see, in the next 10 years, much more care will be delivered at home, which probably is going to be to the advantage of the patient, because digital health is going to enable that. At the same time, we need to be very mindful about that and the importance of that, and make sure that we're developing structured data that can become information, and know every stakeholder, because you have to drive value for them. If the payer doesn't believe in it, then they're not going to cover it. They're not going to pay the hospital for it. They're not going to cover it for the patient. So when you're developing something, map all your stakeholders, map what would drive value for them. Make sure that you understand the value drivers by stakeholder, and build the evidence to support that value. If you do that successfully, then you're going to be in a much stronger position to be successful in launching, and to do what the ultimate goal is in the healthcare system today, which is to improve outcomes and lower costs, right? That's what we're trying to drive towards. And so, explain that. Don't say, oh, the operation is going to be 15 minutes less. That's an efficiency argument, and nobody's paying for that. Now, if you're going to say that, the operation is only 4 hours and now it's 15 minutes, that might be great to you. You think that, but it's not going to be great to the doctor, because now the RVU for his procedure just went from 4 hours to 15 minutes. So that may work against you, because that doesn't support physician reimbursement. So understanding, again, all of those pieces are really important. And if you're going to drive the procedure out of the physician's hand, then you need to be thinking about how you get his support, because you have to provide value to him in a different way. So it's a very holistic concept. And that's why I say understand the business model of healthcare. And I think you'll be much more successful in building your value platform and getting adoption across all of your key stakeholders, from physician, provider, and payer.
Leslie, thank you. What I would like, the way I'm going to sum this up for everyone as well, I'll take my 1 minute at this. So it's an extremely exciting time, because with the ability to do data analytics, generate data, aggregate data, and process data, we're now transforming medical devices to medical technology. And now we'll have the ability, potentially, that our devices not only do a particular task, but we actually can improve the skill of that task to the surgeon or to a physician, be it in a pulmonologist's office or in the operating room. And we could also develop tools that will help augment judgment. If we do both of those correctly, we'll improve surgical outcome. And we can also at the same time democratize a lot of what is provided, so that if you think about it, the opportunities we have not only in the United States, but outside of the United States to improve the standard of healthcare for all, that should be our mission. And I think we also have to remember that data unto itself is useless unless it's transformed into knowledge. Right. So data for data's sake is useless. Continually to focus on the unmet need and who you're serving. Think about workflow. Will it disrupt the current workflow? That will lead to poor adoption. This is extremely important to understand the user, be it the patient, the physician, the hospital, or the payer. And then finally, there needs to be a business model, because without a business model, none of this that's the engine that will drive the adoption. With that, I want to thank both of you very much, Naomi and Leslie. Thank you for your time. I want to thank everyone in the audience for being with us. I hope you found this valuable, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.